about the chapter 2, that is translation theory before the 20th century. The introduction. The aim of this chapter is not to attempt a comprehensive history of translation of translator through the age. This would be beyond the scope of any book's instance. The main focus is the central recurring theme of word for word and of sense for sense translation, a debate that dominates much of translation theory. And the second is word for word of sense for sense. Up until the second half of the 20th century, Western translation theories seemed look in what George Steiner, and I didn't translate them as an interpreter, but as an orator, keeping the same ideas from, or as Sam might say, the figures of thought, but in language conform to our usage. And in so doing, I didn't hold it necessary to render word for word, but I appreciate the general style and force of the language. And the second is early Chinese and Arabic discourse on translation. Jerome's statement is usually taken to the clearest expression of the literal and free prose in translation. The same concern have been represented in other rich and ancient translation traditions such as in China and the Arab world. For instance, Hang and Pollard uses similar terms when describing the history. And the third is introducing translation studies. The vocabulary of Hang and Pollard description, such as a ghost of Iggy, shows the influence of modern Western translation terminology, the general thrust of the argument being similar to the Caesar Jerome's Paul of described above. This, this is especially so because there are alternative translations for the terms. Literary is the translation of meaning. The translation choose were expounded in the preface to this text, perhaps the most influential being by the religious, who directed an extensive translation programs of Buddhist sutras. This preface consider the dilemma which ever faced Buddhist translator, whether to make a free, polished, and certain version adapted to the taste of the Chinese public, or a faithful, literal, repetitious, and therefore unreadable translation. Okay, and now it is about the humanists and the Protestant Reformation. Within Western society, issues of fee and literal translation were for over 1,000 years after Jerome's born up with the translation of the Bible and other religious and philosophical texts. Before the arrival of the printing press in China in the 11th century IC, in Europe in the 15th century IC, texts were laboriously copied by hand, which led to numerous errors of variance readings. Language and translation become the site of alleged power struggle. Latin, controlled by the Christ in Rome, had a stranglehold of knowledge and religion until challenged by the European humanist movement of the 14th and 15th centuries. And the revolution in Bible translation practiced in Europe was girlfriends by humanists advanced in the study and knowledge of Greek and Arabic and of classical scholarship. In culmination was a smooth addition of practical Greek general climate of the Reformation and the new technology of the printing press mean the Bible translation dominated, dominated book production. And then after that is fidelity, spirit, and truth. In her early theories of translation, Vera Amos see the history of the theory of translation as by no means of record of easily distinguishable orderly progression. For her, theory was generally incarnate and amount to a broad series of preface and comment by questioners who often ignore or we ignorant of Eleanor discourse as a result. And then this lack of censorship in Christendom is probably partly uncountable for the soreness with this translation attend the power put into word clearly and unmistakably their aims and method. For instance, I must note that early translators often directed considerable considerably in the meaning they gave to them such a faithful accuracy, and even the word translational itself. But I think that is the such concept are investigated by Lewis Carroll in The True Interpreter. Kelly looks in the detail at the history of the recent translation theory. Because starting with the teaching of the great and Latin writers of classically antiquity and tracing the history of what the cause inexplicably translate themes fidelity, spirit, and truth. These were seats for contestation depending to a large degree on historical context and on social conceptualism of translation. So, the main point that is the concept of the faithful interpreter had initially been dismissed as literal, word for word translation by Horace. Indeed, it was not until the end, because of the 17th century, that literally had come to generally identified with faithfulness to the meaning rather than the word of the author. And then the five is the early attempt in systematic translation theory, Dryden, Gerald Toller, and Young Folk. For Amos, the England of the 17th century with Denham, Cowley, and Gerald marked the important step forward in translation theory with deliberate reason statement and the unmistakable in their purpose and meaning. All the time apart from the Bible, translated into English will almost exclusively confined to first a granny of Greek and Latin classic. Because at the time translation had come to be valued as an exercise, creatively and novelty, some of these designs were extremely free of harm. And then the sixth is that is about the cranial matter and the evolution of the foreigns. In Germany, the word of psychologist Johann girlfriend Hitler on the language and thought was to have an important influence over the Germany Romantic of the early 19th century. And then the last is this about the two-word contemporary transition theory. In this detailed idiosyncratic classification of the early history of transition theory, George Trainer lists a small number of 14 writers to prepare for nearly the sum total of those who have said anything fundamental or new about translation. Other modern translation assure that the main problem with the writing of translation in this period was the criteria for judgment were very for the vague and subjects, and that the judgments themselves were highly normative. As a reaction against such a figures and contradiction, translation theory in the second half of 20th century made various attempts to refer, redefine the concept literary and fee in original terms. So the main point of this explanation is the general trend of recent translation theory for Israel in critical as equally to the 20th century center on the recurring debate as to whether translation should be literal, word for word, or free sense for sense, a right that is famously discussed by Jerome in the translation The Bible into Latin. Betting all about my explanation about this chapter too. Thank you very much. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe this video. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you.